"Sir, we don't have wheelchairs for your kind of request. You'll have to walk or wait." The young airport employee's voice sliced through the bustling terminal, sharp and cold as a winter wind off Lake Michigan. His words, dripping with impatience, landed like a slap across 78-year-old James Jim Carver's weathered face. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows on the polished floor of O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 3. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and overpriced coffee, a mix that churned Jim's stomach as he gripped the worn leather handle of his carry-on, his knuckles whitening. Jim, a Vietnam War veteran with a silver star pinned to his memory, stood hunched over his cane, his knees trembling from arthritis that had worsened since his last VA visit. His gray hair, cropped short in military fashion, glistened with sweat under the terminal's unforgiving lights. He'd been traveling to D.C. for a veterans' reunion, a rare chance to reconnect with the dwindling number of brothers-in-arms who'd made it through the jungles of '68. In his jacket pocket, tucked close to his heart, was a faded photograph of his old squad, smiling, young, unbroken, taken days before the ambush that left him with shrapnel scars and a limp. He'd planned to show it to his friend Tommy's widow at the reunion, a small gesture to honor a promise made decades ago. But now, standing in the crowded terminal, that plan felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The employee, a wiry man in his 20s with a name tag reading Tyler, barely looked up from his clipboard. His eyes flicked over Jim's faded army jacket, the one with a faint stain from a spilled coffee during a VFW meeting years ago, and his lips curled into a dismissive smirk. "Look, sir, we're short-staffed. You should have booked assistance in advance. Gates that way." He jerked his thumb toward a sign pointing to Gate C-17, a good quarter-mile trek through the chaotic terminal. Passengers rushed past, their rolling suitcases clattering like distant gunfire, each sound making Jim flinch, his mind flickering to memories of monsoon-soaked patrols. Jim's chest tightened, not just from the pain in his legs but from the sting of being reduced to an inconvenience. He'd faced worse: enemy fire, monsoon floods, the ache of losing men he called brothers. But this was a different kind of wound. "Son," he said, his voice low but steady, honed by years of commanding respect, "I served this country for 2 tours. I just need a little help to get to my gate." His hazel eyes, still sharp despite his age, locked onto Tyler's, searching for a shred of understanding. Tyler sighed, rolling his eyes as if Jim's words were a tired script. "Yeah, well, policy's policy. No pre-booking, no wheelchair. You can sit there." He pointed to a row of hard plastic chairs nearby, already crowded with exhausted travelers. "Or figure it out." The casual cruelty in his tone hit Jim harder than he expected, stirring a familiar ache of being overlooked, undervalued, cast aside. He thought of the VA waiting rooms, the endless forms, the clerks who treated him like a number instead of a man who'd carried wounded soldiers through hell. Around them, the terminal pulsed with life. A mother wrangled 2 screaming kids near a coffee kiosk, their voices piercing the air like sirens. A businessman in a sharp suit barked into his phone, oblivious to Jim's struggle. An elderly woman, her hands shaking as she clutched a boarding pass, glanced at Jim with sympathy but said nothing, her own worries anchoring her in place. The crowd moved like a river, indifferent to the man standing still, his cane trembling against the floor. Jim's throat tightened as he swallowed the urge to shout, to demand the respect he'd earned through blood and sacrifice. Instead, he took a slow breath, the kind he used to steady his aim in the jungle, and adjusted his grip on the cane. "All right," Jim muttered, more to himself than to Tyler, who'd already turned away to bark orders at a coworker. He shuffled toward the chairs, each step a battle against the fire in his joints. His mind raced, replaying the employee's words, "Your kind of request," like a stuck record. What did that even mean? Too old? Too broken? Too much of a relic from a war nobody cared about anymore? He sank into a chair, the plastic cold against his back, and pulled the photograph from his pocket. His fingers traced the faces of his squad lingering on Tommy's grin. "Should have known better, old friend," he whispered, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "World's changed, but not that much." As he sat, the terminal's noise seemed to fade, replaced by a hollow hum in his ears. He felt the weight of every year, every scar, every moment he'd fought to prove his worth. But then a new sound cut through the haze, a sharp, rhythmic clack of boots on the floor growing louder, closer. Jim looked up, his eyes narrowing as a group of young men and women in crisp ROTC uniforms appeared at the edge of the concourse, their faces set with purpose. He didn't know it yet, but something was about to shift, like the first rumble of a storm rolling in. "We've only just begun this story, but trust me, it's about to get even more intense. Stick around to see what happens when Jim faces even greater injustice, and how the tide starts to turn." James Jim Carver sat in the unforgiving plastic chair, the cold seeping through his worn army jacket, his cane propped against his knee like a loyal but battered soldier. The O'Hare terminal buzzed around him, a relentless swarm of noise, announcements crackling over the intercom, the clatter of luggage wheels, the sharp laughter of a group of college kids heading to spring break. The air was thick with the scent of pretzels from a nearby kiosk and the faint tang of cleaning solution. But to Jim, it all felt suffocating, like the humid jungles of Vietnam where every breath was a labor. His fingers tightened around the faded photograph in his pocket, the edges worn soft from years of handling. The faces of his squad stared back at him in his mind's eye, their youthful grins a stark contrast to the ache in his chest now. He'd been waiting 10 minutes, each one stretching longer than the last, his legs throbbing with every pulse of his heart. The young airport employee, Tyler, had vanished into the chaos of the terminal, leaving Jim stranded in a sea of indifference. He'd asked a passing gate agent for help, a woman with a tight bun and a distracted frown, but she'd only muttered something about being swamped before hurrying off, her heels clicking like gunfire on the polished floor. Jim's request for a wheelchair, a simple plea to make it to gate C-17 in time for his flight to D.C., had been brushed off like dust from a shelf. His pride stung, but worse was the creeping doubt gnawing at him. Maybe he was just a burden, a relic nobody had time for. He shifted in the chair, wincing as a jolt of pain shot through his hip. The arthritis was merciless today, a reminder of the shrapnel still lodged in his body from '68. He'd carried a wounded private to safety that day, under fire, his own blood mixing with the mud. Yet here in this gleaming airport, he couldn't even get a wheelchair. The irony burned. He glanced at the crowd, hoping to catch someone's eye. But the travelers streamed past, businessmen glued to their phones, families wrestling with overstuffed bags, a young couple arguing over a missed connection. To them, Jim was invisible, just an old man in a faded jacket clutching a cane like it was his last lifeline. Then a new voice broke through the din, sharp and commanding. "Hey, you! You can't just sit there blocking the walkway." A security guard, broad-shouldered and wearing a neon vest that screamed authority, loomed over Jim. His name tag read Martinez, and his eyes were hard, scanning Jim like he was a problem to be solved. "This is a high-traffic area. Move along or I'll have to escort you out." The guard's tone carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt as if ready to call for backup. Jim's jaw tightened, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fire. "I'm waiting for assistance. I can't walk to my gate. Your staff told me to sit here." He gestured toward the concourse where Tyler had disappeared. The guard's eyes narrowed, taking in Jim's cane, his weathered face, the faint outline of a service patch on his jacket. For a moment, Jim thought he saw a flicker of recognition, maybe respect, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Rules are rules," Martinez said, crossing his arms. "No loitering. If you can't move, I'll have to assume you're causing a disturbance." His words were a gut punch, each one landing heavier than the last. Jim felt the eyes of nearby passengers, some curious, some annoyed, boring into him. A woman with a stroller whispered to her husband, who shook his head. A teenager pulled out his phone, the camera lens glinting as he started recording, his smirk as sharp as a blade. Jim's face burned, not with shame but with a slow, smoldering anger. He'd faced down enemy fire, carried men through hell, and now he was being treated like a vagrant in his own country. "I served 2 tours in Vietnam," Jim said, his voice rising just enough to carry over the terminal's hum. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just need to get to my gate." He pulled the photograph from his pocket, holding it up like a shield. "This is why I'm here. To honor my squad. You telling me I can't even do that?" His hand trembled, not from weakness but from the weight of decades. Memories of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the promises he'd made to men who never came home. Martinez hesitated, his expression softening for a split second before hardening again. "Look, I don't make the rules. You need to move or I'm calling my supervisor." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over Jim, who felt the terminal closing in, the noise amplifying, the air growing heavier. The teenager with the phone snickered, whispering to a friend, "Check out this old guy making a scene." A woman nearby gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth, but no one spoke up. The crowd's silence was louder than their chatter, a wall of apathy that pressed against Jim's chest. Inside, Jim wrestled with a storm of emotions, anger at the injustice, shame at being singled out, fear that he'd miss his flight and let down the widow waiting in D.C. He thought of Tommy, the friend in the photograph, who died in his arms after that ambush. "Keep going, Jim," Tommy had gasped, his voice fading. Jim had promised to carry on, to live for both of them. Now that promise felt like it was slipping away, crushed under the weight of a system that didn't care. His fingers tightened around the photograph, its edges digging into his palm, grounding him. He wouldn't give up, not yet. Just as Martinez reached for his radio, a new sound cut through the tension, crisp, rhythmic, like a drum beat. It was the sound of boots, steady and purposeful, echoing down the concourse. Jim's eyes flicked up, catching sight of the ROTC cadets he'd noticed earlier, their uniforms sharp and their faces intense. They were closer now, moving with a precision that reminded him of his own platoon days. A woman in the lead, her braid tucked neatly under her cap, locked eyes with Jim, her expression unreadable but focused. Something was about to happen, something big, and the air in the terminal seemed to crackle with it. We're on the edge of something massive. What happens next will flip everything upside down. You don't want to miss how this unfolds. Stay with us for the climax that's about to shake the terminal. The rhythmic clack of boots grew louder, slicing through the chaotic hum of O'Hare's Terminal 3 like a blade through fog. Jim Carver, still seated, his weathered hands gripping his cane, felt his breath hitch as the crowd parted. The ROTC cadets, 10 strong, their uniforms a crisp reminder of the discipline he'd once lived by, formed a semicircle around him, their faces a mix of determination and quiet fury. The air, heavy with the scent of jet fuel and stale coffee, seemed to still, as if the terminal itself sensed the shift. Jim's hazel eyes, clouded by pain but sharp with memory, darted to the young woman leading the group. Her name tag read Cadenza, and her posture, shoulders squared, jaw set, reminded him of his platoon sergeant in '68, a man who'd never left a soldier behind. The security guard Martinez froze, his hand still hovering over his radio. His earlier bravado wilted under the cadet's unwavering stares. The teenager filming nearby lowered his phone, his smirk gone, replaced by wide-eyed uncertainty. A hush rippled through the crowd, passengers pausing mid-step, gate agents glancing up from their screens, even the mother with the screaming kids falling silent. Jim's chest tightened, not from the ache in his legs, but from a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, fragile but fierce, like a spark in dry grass. Cadenza stepped forward, her voice clear and commanding, cutting through the tension like a bugle call. "Sir," she said, addressing Jim directly, "we're here to get you to your gate. No one gets left behind on our watch." Her words landed like a lifeline, pulling Jim back from the edge of despair. He blinked, his throat tight, as memories of his squad flooded in. Men who'd carried each other through mud and blood, who'd made promises in the dark that they kept till their last breath. The photograph in his pocket, faded but heavy with meaning, seemed to pulse against his heart. Martinez bristled, regaining his composure. "This is a restricted area," he snapped, his voice louder than necessary as if to reclaim authority. "You can't just barge in here and—" "Stand down," Cadenza interrupted, her tone ice-cold but professional. She held up a hand, her gaze never leaving Martinez. "This veteran needs assistance, and your staff failed him. We're stepping in." The other cadets moved in unison, 2 of them, broad-shouldered young men with buzz cuts, gently approaching Jim. "Sir, may we help you stand?" one asked, his voice soft but firm, his eyes meeting Jim's with a respect that hit harder than any salute. Jim nodded, his pride wrestling with his need. "I'd appreciate that, son," he said, his voice rough but steady. As they helped him to his feet, their hands strong yet careful, the crowd erupted into murmurs. A woman in a business suit clapped softly, then louder, her eyes glistening. An elderly man with a walker nodded, his lips trembling. The teenager with the phone started filming again, but this time his expression was one of awe, not mockery. Jim felt the weight of their stares, not as judgment, but as witness to something bigger than himself. But the conflict wasn't over. Tyler, the employee who'd dismissed Jim earlier, pushed through the crowd, his clipboard clutched like a shield. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice high-pitched with indignation. "You can't just disrupt operations. This man didn't follow protocol." His eyes darted to Jim, then away as if the veteran's gaze burned. The crowd's murmurs grew sharper, a few voices muttering shame and unbelievable. A young mother, her toddler clinging to her leg, called out, "He's a veteran? Show some respect!" The words hung in the air, a spark igniting the terminal's restless energy. Cadenza turned to Tyler, her expression a mix of steel and sorrow. "Protocol doesn't trump humanity," she said, her voice carrying to the edges of the concourse. "This man served our country. You had a chance to honor that and failed. We're fixing it." She nodded to her team, and in a seamless motion the cadets formed a protective escort around Jim. 2 supported him under his arms, their strength steadying his trembling legs, while others cleared a path through the crowd. The rhythmic clack of their boots resumed, a drumbeat of purpose that drowned out Tyler's sputtered protests. As they moved toward Gate C-17, the crowd transformed. Strangers stepped aside, some saluting, others wiping tears. A pilot, his cap tucked under his arm, stood at attention as Jim passed, his nod a silent acknowledgement of shared sacrifice. Jim's chest swelled, not with pride but with a quiet catharsis. He thought of Tommy, the friend in the photograph whose widow he'd promised to visit. "I'm making it, brother," he whispered, his fingers brushing the pocket where the picture rested. The pain in his legs faded, overshadowed by the warmth of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. At the gate, a new figure emerged. A silver-haired man in a suit, his badge identifying him as the airport's operations manager. His face was grim, his eyes scanning the scene before landing on Jim. "Mr. Carver," he said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I was just informed of what happened. On behalf of O'Hare, I apologize. This isn't who we are." He extended his hand, and Jim, after a moment's hesitation, shook it, the grip firm and real. The manager turned to Tyler, who stood frozen at the edge of the group. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. We'll be reviewing this incident thoroughly." The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, a few shouts of, "About time!" Tyler's face drained of color, his clipboard slipping to the floor with a clatter. Martinez, still lingering nearby, lowered his head, his earlier authority gone. The cadets stood tall, their mission complete, but their presence a quiet reminder of what duty looked like. Cadenza handed Jim a small pin, a silver eagle, the ROTC's emblem. "For your service, sir," she said softly. Jim pinned it to his jacket, next to the faint coffee stain, his fingers trembling not from weakness but from gratitude. As Jim boarded the plane, assisted by a gate agent who couldn't stop apologizing, he glanced back at the terminal. The cadets were dispersing, their boots still echoing faintly. The crowd had begun to scatter, but their faces, strangers turned witnesses, lingered in his mind. He settled into his seat, the photograph now resting on his lap, Tommy's grin catching the light. For the first time that day, Jim smiled, a small but real victory carved from the ashes of injustice.